Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to my presentation, Canada, a multilingual country with two official languages. So my name is Matthew, and I'll give you a bit of an overview about what will be discussed today. So to start off, I'll give a bit of an introduction to the basics about Canada, just a bit of background information in case people want to know, where it is, some interesting facts about it. Then I'll have an overview of Canada's official languages and some statistics about that. And that's really mostly English and French that we have in Canada as our two official languages. But as you'll see in this presentation, we have, a bunch of other languages that are widely spoken in Canada and that have been in Canada for a really long time. Then I'll talk a bit about Canada's Indigenous languages. So these are languages that have been spoken in Canada for the last 10,000 years. And these are languages that were spoken before French and English came to Canada and are still spoken today, even though not as widely spoken, obviously, as before. They're still important languages in Canada. Then I'll get to some of Canada's immigrant languages, which is the Canadian term for any language that's not English, French, or Indigenous to Canada. So that's languages like Cantonese, Mandarin, Tagalog. So there's quite a few of those that we'll go over. And then I'll talk a bit about some current trends that are happening in Canadian languages and a look at some of the major cities in Canada. So here are the basics. Canada is located in North America. It's the northernmost country. The population is 35 million people, and the country itself is split into 13 provinces and territories. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'll divide Canada into west, central, east, and north. And so that's sort of the way we'll think about it for this presentation, just to make things simple. Canada's capital is Ottawa, which is located towards the center of Canada here. The largest city in Canada is Toronto, with a population of 2.7 million people, and our national sports are hockey and lacrosse. So lacrosse is a racket and ball game. It's very similar to I guess it's a combination of hockey on a field, I guess, with a racket that you use to carry a small ball, and the goal is to sort of throw the ball into the net. So it's the second largest country in the world and 38th in terms of population. So this means that it has several densely populated cities that are separated by large distances. To give you an example, between, say, Toronto and Montreal, you have about 500 kilometers of road. So there's quite a bit of space between the large cities in Canada. As a result, there's regional differences between cities and provinces, so different climates, different languages, and different heritages as well. So to give you an example, one question I always get is, isn't it cold in Canada? People think that Canadians have to wear a winter coat until early August, and then beginning of September we're right back in the winter coats. This isn't really the case. So depending on where you go, we get pretty hot summers, around 30 degrees, and depending where you go, we get pretty harsh winters, so minus 50, minus 45 in the northern parts of Canada. So huge difference in terms of climate. In terms of language, we have one province that's predominantly a French-speaking province. So in that province, you have people who are mostly speaking French as a first language. And then we also have several provinces where the most spoken language is going to be English. And that's again another difference. So depending on where you go, different language. The most populous province or territory is Ontario, about 13.4 million people, and the least populous is the territory Yukon with 35,000 people. So you can see there's even a big swing in terms of population density. Canada was founded in 1867, and at first it was much smaller. I don't have the map up anymore, but it was actually just sort of two provinces, and the country expanded both east, west, and north, and grew over time, and today to be the 13 provinces. So the two most widely spoken languages in Canada are still French and English. There are about 20 million native English speakers and 7.5 million native French speakers. And most of these native French speakers are located in the province of Quebec. That being said, there were over 200 languages reported on the last census as a home language or mother tongue. So that means that in Canada we have a ton of languages that you can actually hear on the streets and that you'll actually meet real speakers of these languages. So Canada officially became a bilingual country in 1969 with the Official Languages Act. The goal of this was to ensure that Canadians could have access to service in both English and French. And so this has been an issue throughout Canada where in the areas where people mostly speak English, there have been Yeah. So we're just going to take a quick technical pause of a few minutes. I think there's an audio issue. Did the battery die? So while this is being fixed, a quick show of hands, who's been to Canada here? Oh wow, okay. We've got some people, all right. How many people have been to a French-speaking part of Canada? Okay, awesome. So if you've been to one of the French-speaking parts of Canada, you probably know then that in Canada we have a lot of different we have a lot of people who speak a lot of different languages, and one of the issues very early on was having access to very basic services in both French and English. So what this act really was aimed at doing was making sure that at least when people were dealing with important things like the government or different services in their communities, that they could have access to service in either French or English. And so this has been really important in provinces like Quebec, where the majority of people speak French, and so Francophone Canadians had to secure services in French, but also English Canadians need access to services in English in those provinces. And so you'll see that that's, if you visited certain parts of Canada, you'll see that that's always a constant balance that we're trying to find. So one important thing to remember is that the Official Languages Act is only applicable to federal institutions. It doesn't apply to provinces or municipalities, and certain provinces and territories have adopted their own policies with languages. So today in Canada, that's been mostly a good thing because that means that most provinces are making an effort to give everyone access to services in both French and English. In the past, it's actually been a lot more controversial, with some parts of Canada really giving no access to services in French, and with there being a lot of controversy over that. And this is what the Official Languages Act was trying to address. So although Canada is officially bilingual, there are some services that are not federal and are not offered in both official languages. So in practice, many services will be offered in only one official language. I know I can say personally that I have a lot of friends who've visited Canada from other countries expecting to have service, say, in banks or stores or other places in both French and English, and that's often not the case, depending where you go. Where is it the case that you can have services in both French? So I'm going to ask just that the questions wait until the end. So just to give you a quick answer to that, in Montreal, it's a very bilingual city. Most people are able to hold a conversation in both, at least a basic conversation in both French or English. But as you leave that city, Canada becomes much more linguistically diverse. So you still have people who speak other languages, but not necessarily English and French.
Any offices, I don't know, if you want to arrange something, I don't know, a document in Calgary, and then you speak French.
It can be tricky. It can be tricky. So Most provinces, this ensures that English-speaking and French-speaking parents can send, okay, so one really important thing is that there are specific language rights that are protected in the Constitution for education. And so in Section 23 of our Constitution, we have protections for parents to send children to the language education, normally of their choice. And what this ensures in most provinces is that English-speaking and French-speaking parents can send their children to the school that matches their official language. So in Ontario or Alberta, this means that you have French schools in predominantly English-speaking provinces, and then in Quebec, which is Canada's only French unilingual province, you still have English schools. So to get to Quebec, Quebec is actually the only province that has French as its only official language. There is some protection for English speakers in the province, but the majority of the population is French speaking. According to the most recent census, 94% of people in Quebec can hold at least a basic conversation in French. One thing to keep in mind, especially people visiting from Europe or outside of Canada, is that each language that's spoken in Canada has a very specific Canadian twist to it. So it's whether you're talking about English, whether you're talking about French, there are different terms and different expressions that we're going to use back in Canada that might not be used elsewhere. And so this is something that comes up often when people visit the French-speaking parts of Canada as well, because the French use is definitely adapted towards the country where it's set. French is spoken in about 80% of homes, and nearly half the province is able to speak both French and English, although that group of people who are able to speak both is concentrated mostly in Montreal. So while you're in Montreal, you're probably fine speaking English or French with anybody that you meet. As soon as you get outside of Montreal, depending on where you are, you might have more success using English, or most likely you'll have more success using French. So just some quick statistics. The most English and French bilingual province is Quebec, which 44.5% of people able to speak both languages. The least bilingual territory is Nunavut, where only about 4.3% of people can speak both English and French. So this gives you an idea of how much we have bilingualism in Canada, but it's actually quite uneven. And the national average is about 18%, so 1 in 5 Canadians that you meet will be able to speak both languages. Now, in addition to the official languages, we also have, like I mentioned, languages that are Indigenous to Canada and have been spoken in Canada for centuries. The 5 most spoken languages are Cree, Inuktitut, Ojibwe, Oji-Cree, and Dene. A quick background on these languages. The first 3, Cree, Inuktitut, and Ojibwe, are vibrant languages that are spoken today by thousands of speakers. And unfortunately, out of all of the Indigenous languages in Canada, these are the only 3 that are considered languages that are not endangered by linguists. So this means that for the rest of Canada's Indigenous languages, there are serious efforts that are being made right now to revitalize the languages and to get people speaking them again. So for the last few hundred years, Canada has made several efforts to eliminate Indigenous languages. For a very long time, Canada had a very unilingual policy, which was to try to have the entire country speaking English. And so over centuries, the government weakened the vibrancy, really, of a lot of Canada's Indigenous languages. Although there are over 70 that are spoken in Canada, there are only 3 that are considered strong and vibrant today. And so right now, around the country, there's several efforts that are being made to revitalize Indigenous languages. So some of the projects are things like online dictionaries. There are also language groups that are being put together right now so that people can meet and speak the language, use it in their everyday life, use it as a part of culture. And in addition to that, there are also some government programs. So trying to put these languages back in schools and get students actually studying in these languages, using them every day, and having a chance to really apply the language to the culture. It's important to mention, though, that even though the languages themselves are, most of them are on the decline, Indigenous culture in Canada isn't on the decline, and that's one of the things that makes the languages able to be revived. So the cultures themselves are actually quite strong, and really the goal right now by the government and a lot of communities around the country is to get people in communities that are Indigenous using native languages that they have as a mother tongue, rather than solely depending on English and French. So Cree is the most widely spoken Indigenous language in Canada, with 83,000 speakers who have Cree as their mother tongue. So it's spoken in several different dialects over a very large geographical area in Canada. To go back to what I was mentioning before, if you think of Canada as west, central, east, north, it's spoken from the west all the way to the east, in several different dialects, but the same language. And roughly 24,000 people with Cree as their mother tongue live in Saskatchewan, where it's the third most common mother tongue after English and German. The second language, Inuktitut, is spoken by over 34,000 speakers. So it's spoken primarily in Nunavut and Quebec, so northern and central Canada. And the language can be written with both the Roman alphabet and also using syllabics. In Nunavut, schools offer Inuktitut education, and the government has a stated goal of territory-wide bilingualism. And the relationship between culture and language is a big focus of efforts to preserve the language. So in Nunavut, there are several cultural events that go on where the goal of those events is to not only highlight the language, but apply the language to people's everyday lives. So that means updating words, for the digital age and for like social media and things like that, but also getting people to use it when they go out, spend time with friends, and have it be an integrated part of the culture, a living language. The third language is Ojibwe, with 130,000 Ojibwe speakers in Canada, and the majority of Ojibwe speakers are located in Manitoba. And again, like with many languages indigenous to Canada, there are efforts to revitalize that with a lot of different online projects. Now, in terms of immigrant languages in Canada, the top 5 foreign languages are Mandarin, Cantonese, Punjabi, Spanish, and Tagalog. So I'm going to quickly talk a bit about Mandarin and Cantonese in Canada. So Chinese immigration to Canada goes back to the 18th century. And Chinese Canadians have been involved in several large socioeconomic movements in Canada. So one of the big movements that people are aware of is the Canadian National Railway. So very early on, one of the goals for Canada was to build a railway that could connect the west of Canada all the way to the east of Canada. With a country as big as Canada is, this was sort of a central project for the early Canadian government. A big part of being able to build this railway was the contribution of Chinese Canadian workers who came over to Canada and helped build the railway from east to west. A lot of the workers who came to Canada at that time decided to stay, and so there are Canadian Chinese communities that have been established going back really to before Canada was a country. Again, there's also a lot of Chinese Canadian immigration during the gold rush. So normally that's associated with California, but there was also a gold rush that sort of moved north into what's today British Columbia. And again, a lot of Chinese Canadian workers were involved in that. And then obviously with the world wars and different movements like that, another movement, again, that was heavily influenced by Chinese Canadians. So today in Canada, we're roughly even in terms of Mandarin and Cantonese speakers. As you can see, we have about 592,000 Mandarin speakers and 565,000 Cantonese speakers. And this is actually a bit of a flip from the last time there was a census where there were in fact significantly more Cantonese speakers. So Canada is slowly becoming more Mandarin than Cantonese, but today you can easily hear both languages in a lot of major cities. The picture I have here is actually it's not so clear on the projector. It's actually a picture of the Chinatown in Toronto. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of signage using Chinese characters. And taking a walk through Chinatown in Toronto, you can easily find Mandarin, Cantonese written in shops, products labeled in both languages, in Chinese characters, sorry, and salespeople who are ready to speak to you in either Mandarin or Cantonese, depending on the language that you choose. More than just a center of language, though, it's important to remember that Chinatown is also a center of culture too. So a lot of the shops, a lot of the ingredients even that you can buy in the supermarkets, right, are central to the connection between the language and the culture. And Chinese Canadians setting up this sort of market very early on in Toronto and building it up. The second language I'll speak about is Tagalog. So today, Tagalog has 525,000 speakers in Canada who use it as a home language. It's the most widely spoken home language after English and French in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and Yukon. So if we're thinking about that geographically, we're talking about central, western, and northern Canada. So very, very influential language at this time, and a language that's on the rise. It's the fastest rising non-official language spoken in Canada. And the number of Tagalog speakers rose by 64% between 2006 and 2011, which is the last count. So just to talk a bit about Canada's linguistic diversity, as you can probably see, each city sort of brings its own interesting flair to linguistic diversity. The languages that you'll be able to speak in one city, you might not be able to practice in another. And really, most of Canada's linguistic diversity is in its 6 major metropolitan areas: Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Montreal. Now, it's important to remember that these cities are, again, like I mentioned, very spread out from each other. So as you go from one city to the other, you have huge differences in terms of the demographics, but also just in terms of the culture in the city. So Toronto, this is actually a picture of Toronto's City Hall. You have nearly 1/3 of residents speaking a different mother tongue along with English. And about 1/3 of Torontonians speak a language other than English or French at home. And what this means is that just walking the streets of Toronto, you can easily hear 5, 6, 7 languages on an average day just walking the street. I can say personally from my neighborhood, I often hear Mandarin, Cantonese, French, Spanish. I live just north of where you can hear a lot of Portuguese and Italian, and that's all within maybe a 20, 25-minute walk. As you spread out and see different parts of the city, again, there are just many different languages that are spoken. In Montreal, 626,000 people speak an immigrant language, most often at home. And in Montreal, the 2 biggest languages spoken at home are Arabic, with about 108,000 speakers, and Spanish, with about 95,000 speakers. One interesting fact about Montreal is that more than 21% of Montrealers can speak at least 3 languages, and more than 40% of the city's immigrants are in fact trilingual. So Montreal is Canada's most trilingual city. This comes from the fact that for many people who move to Montreal, the first thing that they want to do is learn English and French. And if they're coming from another country, a lot of times this means that they're going to bring at least one other mother tongue along with these two languages. And so you have many people who speak English, French, and Italian, for instance, English, French, Cantonese, English, French, Mandarin, depending on what people's country of origin is. And it's not uncommon to hear, a conversation on the streets of Montreal in 2, even 3 languages. One person asks a question in English, somebody else will respond in French, or maybe they'll respond in Spanish, maybe they'll respond in Italian. It all just kind of works. In Vancouver, 712,000 people speak an immigrant language, most often at home. So 163,000 people who speak Punjabi as a native language, and 373,000 people who speak Cantonese or Mandarin as a native language. So it's important to remember here that for a very long time in Canada, there was very little distinction made between Cantonese and Mandarin. So very often you'll see statistics that are mixed, which is speakers of Cantonese or Mandarin, and at times you'll see a breakdown with Cantonese, Mandarin, and other Chinese languages, just depending on who's taking the statistics and when they were taken. And Vancouver is a city where they have large cultural events that give an opportunity to live the language. So for instance, there's a large Chinese New Year celebration, one of the biggest celebrations in the city. And this again is an opportunity for language to sort of meet culture and for people to use the language in practice rather than just sort of learning it in, learning it from a textbook or learning it at school. In Calgary, Punjabi and Tagalog are the most widely spoken immigrant languages. And in fact, you have 27,000 Punjabi speakers and 24,000 Tagalog speakers. And then finally, you have Nunavut, which is, again, to place it in the geography, is towards the north. And the official languages in this territory are the Inuit languages, Inuktitut and Inuinnaqtun, and as well as English and French. And in this territory, you have 83% of people who have Inuit language as their mother tongue. So I guess the big takeaway from this presentation, obviously, is that in Canada you have hundreds of languages that you can find, hundreds of languages that are accessible. And even though English and French are our main two, we do actually have a really great linguistic diversity. And I think it makes it a very interesting country for people who are interested in languages, because there's no shortage of opportunity to actually practice languages and really practice them in culture. So while you're out at a festival, while you're with friends, while you're at somebody's home, while you're out for a meal with friends. Do we have any questions? We can start with Slido and then move on to the questions in here. Okay.
So the most voted question was if it is mandatory in Canadian middle and high schools to learn the other language, meaning French or English.
The short answer is usually yes. It's been pretty controversial because each province is able to manage its own education. So going back to the slide about Canada's Official Languages Act, that only touches things that the Canadian government manages, but it doesn't touch things that are managed by the provincial government. So each province gets to decide whether it will mandate French or English language courses, and then each province gets to decide what that means. So in my case, growing up, I took French classes from first year of school, so grade 1, all the way until high school. But in several provinces, you might only take French or English for 1 or 2 years, or depending on the resources that your school has, you might not have access to really advanced courses.
Also, what do you think would happen if Quebec would become independent? How likely is that to happen in this century, in your opinion?
Whoa. This is a very loaded question. Can you go back to the first part of it?
What would be the consequences?
Well, I think the immediate consequence would be that Quebec would be its own country, and Canada would, not have Quebec as a province anymore. What was the second part of the question?
How likely is this to happen, in your opinion?
That's a really tough question because, I think it's something that changes with political opinion and sort of what people's motivations are. I think today most Canadians are really happy with the fact that Canada is one country and sort of moving in one direction. But, you can never predict what's going to happen. So all bets are off.
Is there a serious Quebec independence movement? Are there groups that are organizing for this that you're aware of?
There's definitely a serious movement. I mean, it's not something that, it's something that's talked about. It's something that people have mentioned, it's outside of Quebec, it's not mentioned quite as often. Within Quebec, there have been some groups that have brought the idea forward. And, there are different groups that want to separate for different reasons. Canada is a confederation of a lot of different provinces. So each province sort of joined on its own time and for its own reasons. And so it's something that some people want, but I wouldn't say that it's something that's at the forefront right now. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I skipped the most popular question actually.
Okay.
It was if you were speaking in Canadian English right now, or how would it sound?
So what I'm speaking now is Canadian English. I mean, it's very standard. What I can say though is, depending on what province you're in, there are small regional dialects. So for example, in Eastern Canada, you do have dialects of English that incorporate words from, Irish origin or from Scottish origin. And so that's part of the, some of the small differences that we'll have in Canadian English. Even something as small as terms that I might use for something, I mean, subway versus underground or metro, depending on where you are. So there are small differences with the words, but it's the same language.
Did you notice any cultural differences between Europe and Canada?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. Yeah, I've definitely noticed a difference. I would say one of the biggest differences is the push for generally linguistic diversity and really embracing that. So as I mentioned throughout the presentation, in a lot of parts of Canada, even though we do have one language that's dominant, for instance, English or French, there's a real push to have other languages be vibrant and be used in different cultural celebrations. So you can find videos online of the Prime Minister of Canada speaking other languages outside of French and English, and different politicians either trying to campaign and maybe speak to different language communities, or even just celebrating different cultural festivals. So during Chinese New Year, for instance, or different cultural events that we have around the city.
Is there any regulation around language immersion in schools in Canada?
So the short answer is it depends where you go. For instance, in the province of Ontario, so to put that in geographically towards the center in Toronto, there are two school boards. There's a French school board and there's an English school board. And both school boards accept anybody who wants to join, provided that they can make it through the study. So for instance, if a person wants to send their child to an English school, they're able to do that no problem. And for the most part, if a person wants to send their child to French school, then again, for the most part, there's no issue.
They also have extended French and English schools.
Correct.
So you can take like geography or phys ed or something like that in French.
Right, so and that's sort of part of the French immersion program. So you'll have the English school board offer classes in French, and that's usually a program where you start speaking mostly French with a bit of English, and as you move through the program, the ratio sort of flips, and by the end of it, you're speaking mostly English with a bit of French. The logic behind that is that start on the weaker language early when a person is young, get them comfortable studying, working, writing in that language, and as they move through the school system, move them back into the dominant language.
Also, what did you mean by syllabics? You mentioned it at the beginning of the presentation, I think.
Writing in syllabics.
Syllabics, yes. I actually wish I'd included a picture to kind of give it a bit more context. It's really just a way to take the phonetics of the language and put them in a way that, for a lot of early European settlers, it was a way to take what they were hearing and the language that they were, using to trade with the people who were already in Canada when they arrived. And so they took that and turned it into a sort of a way of writing that doesn't use the Roman language. It uses syllabics. It has a symbol for each sound, and it's able to capture, I guess, some of the sounds that are used in Indigenous languages. Yeah.
What is this language situation in Saskatchewan?
Language situation in Saskatchewan. So the language in Saskatchewan is that there are several, of course there are English and French in Saskatchewan, but there's also several Indigenous languages that are there, and obviously Tagalog. So you have several major language groups in Saskatchewan, but that's pretty much the situation.
Less immigrants go to Saskatchewan, I would say. So there's less immigrant languages.
Do you feel that
I'll get to you in a second.
Do you feel that Canadians are generally welcoming to immigrants?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's part of Canada's national identity. I think the Canadian politicians and just general Canadians that you meet really pride themselves in being able to welcome people to Canada. And I think just the history of Canada has been about welcoming people. So you have this first wave of immigrants coming from China, for instance, or English and the French coming to Canada. But then even more recently, you've had a lot of people coming from parts of Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe as well. So, it's just been constant work at incorporating new people and bringing people into the fold.
Also, I'm very
Sorry, just one second. I'm going to come to your question.
One last question, Schleifer, then we have a little bit time for other questions from the audience. We have one very funny question here.
Okay.
Are Canadians so much polite in real life, or it's just a meme, internet meme?
A bit of both, actually. I mean, we're pretty polite, but maybe the memes take it too far. Okay, so I know this gentleman.
Okay, we can take the questions from the audience now, but please repeat the question or respond with a full sentence so that it gets recorded on the camera.
Will do. Okay, so I know this gentleman had a question here.
I always think that when you're talking about bilingual countries, the biggest problem is that there's always a winner and a loser. And it's the same in Belgium. There's always a winner and there's always a loser. There's always one more dominant language, for example. Brussels was always meant to be a bilingual city, but French dominates. And it's often due to the fact of globalism, what there is available, this type of thing. However, and I think the only way for a bilingual country to continue to be bilingual is to force the group which only speaks one language to try and speak the other one, the smaller one, more, and have actual obligation for them to do so. So you look at people in Quebec. The people in Quebec are the only province which speaks French, but it's the highest rate of bilingualism.
Yeah.
It's all the English-speaking provinces where it's the lowest rate of bilingualism. So something has to be done to redress, and I think that this would definitely help with the situation with Quebec and a lot of people feeling like they're an island that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And it would actually help if other provinces were to make it obligatory to learn French. And I think the only way to do that would be to create completely bilingual schools in all provinces. What do you think?
Okay, so just for the recording, I'll kind of summarize what she said, which is that Yeah, that's okay. So, which is that when you have bilingualism, there's a dominant language and a language that becomes dominated, and the only way to redress that really is to force the dominant language to partake in the dominated language. That's a fair way to summarize what you said. So, okay, so I'm just going to quickly jump into this question, just to say that I think there's a lot to that. The fact that Quebec is the only French-speaking province in Canada puts a lot of pressure on it for people from Quebec to learn English. Not only that, but it's the only French-speaking region really in North America. And so that's something that also puts a lot of pressure on the province of Quebec and French speakers in the province because of the fact that, whether you're talking about relations between Quebec and the US, Quebec and the rest of Canada, or even Quebec and most of the world, English has become the lingua franca in North America. So I think that the way to address that is pretty complex because obviously you have the mix between language, which is just what people are speaking, what people know how to speak, and also culture. And I think right now the government is trying to do a lot of different things to address that. I think school is a big part of it, and I think really having both languages being a part not only of education but of culture is a big key.
My question is, do you think that obligation is the way forward?
Yeah, I think it's complicated in practice, but I think it would be great if everybody was able to speak both.
This is what I agree. If you've
I think
got
it'd be great.
a bilingual country constitutionally, then there has to be a certain degree of obligation. And I think this would also work in countries like Wales to preserve their language, countries like Belgium to preserve it.
Fair. So.
The only way to do it is to have 2 lessons a week in Wallonese and Wallon schools in Dutch.
I have a lot of friends who only speak French, and they've been learning Dutch for 15 years, and they still don't know it.
Okay, sorry to cut you off just because we have the recording. I'm going to let this gentleman ask his question.
I also wanted to add something. Another example of a multilingual country is Switzerland. And there it's mainly ruled on the regional level, on the canton level. Most of the cantons are monolingual. Only few are bi or even trilingual. And which language you have to learn is mentioned on the local level.
Right, and so a lot of times actually, so just to repeat for the recording, you mentioned that in Switzerland there are several official languages, but by region, often there'll only be one language spoken inside the region. And so in Canada, I know one big point of comparison is in fact comparing the idea of regional bilingualism, which is sort of considered the Swiss model in Canada, and then a more generalized bilingualism in Canada, which is the model that I think Canada is trying to lean towards. With 1 in 5 Canadians being bilingual, you can see it's only kind of working. But I think the goal really is to have the bilingualism spread across the country rather than use the Swiss model for now, which is to have sectors where people are only speaking one language.
I'll just repeat one question from the slide that wasn't really answered to. Are there many Canadians that are learning any other language besides French and English? I would be particularly interested in these native languages.
So I'll say that with the languages that are indigenous to Canada, I haven't seen a strong movement really for people who are not part of indigenous communities to learn them. A big part of that, I think, is sort of the issue of language meeting culture. So a lot of the efforts to revitalize indigenous languages are happening in indigenous communities, and it's centered around events that normally many Canadians who don't already speak those languages and aren't part of those communities might not make attempts to join into. That being said, there are a lot of people throughout Canada who are attached to Indigenous communities but don't necessarily speak languages related to their communities. And there's a big movement for people to go and not only attach to their communities culturally, but then to go back and get involved in the language.
I'm
Oh.
sorry, one last question.
Okay, is there something like standard Canadian?
Standard.
Official standard Canadian, like,
Um, I would say not so much in English. So in English, I mean, the Canadian style of English is very close to the American one, very close to the British one. Um, and it is considered pretty standard around the world. I would say in terms of the French language, because of the protections that are put in to protect, the way the language changes and the way it's used, there are a few more guidelines and rules that have been put in place to make sure that the sort of erosion that can happen when you have a dominant language surrounding a minority language, you have some more protections there. So there are more writing guides and standards that will set out harder rules and terms and vocabulary more on the French side. Yeah. All right.
Matthew, it's not a question.